Within this field, Taiwan also ranked #1 globally for wafer OEMs and IC packaging and testing. Overall, Taiwan serves as a major Asia-Pacific transportation hub and a global science and technology center. Solid industry foundations, supported by a stable financial system and an outstanding talent pool, have created an excellent investment environment and attracted international capital in Taiwan. Through technology transfers, loans, investment, and talent training, Taiwan has been assisting its diplomatic allies and developing countries to build the capacity to address climate mitigation and adaptation. Taiwan has also proactively sought to increase industry and technical cooperation with Central and Eastern European partners. This year, we announced the establishment of a $1.2 billion investment and credit funds focusing on this region. These funds will promote cooperation in semiconductors, biotechnology, laser technology, and other strategic industries. The government of Taiwan will also be providing scholarship to fund technical training and talent cultivation in Lithuania, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and elsewhere in Europe. The impact of COVID-19 and the rising global tensions have led to restructuring of global supply chains and economic strategies. Here, I see enormous potential for further strengthen ties between Taiwan and Europe. As we enter into the post-pandemic era, Taiwan has shown that it is a natural partner for the EU in its pursuit of open strategic autonomy, particularly in the semiconductor, 5G network, smart machinery, electric vehicle, and biotechnology sectors. We look forward to collaborating with a growing number of European countries to explore even more trade opportunities. The second point I would like to present to you is that I strongly believe Taiwan and the EU should jointly address global challenges by enhancing resilience. Going forward, Taiwan will work with like-minded partners to establish reciprocal industry ties, particularly when some countries in the world have sought to use economic sanction or economic coercion to pursue their political objectives and the expansion of authoritarianism. China's economic sanction against Lithuania not only jeopardize international free trade orders, but also seriously threaten EU's single market system. How to work out an efficient and effective anti-coercion mechanism against economic coercions from foreign malicious countries have become extremely important. Meanwhile, we need to reshape our supply chain to make it more resilient and secure. We are very delighted to see that the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific and the European Chips Act have shown once again that EU receives Taiwan as a crucial partner, and Taiwan is keen to explore opportunities for business cooperation with like-minded countries. Supply chain security is also a matter of national security. As a committee member of the Global Alliance of Democracies, Taiwan is determined to maintain the highest standards of national security. Taiwan has demonstrated its dedication and determination to follow global standards and play by international rules. And Taiwan can be a reliable partner to European countries in the future. And the number 3 point I want to share with you is that we do see a very promising future for the economic partnership and connectivity between Taiwan and the EU. Taiwan and the EU share common and business-friendly values such as democracy, human rights, free market, and the rule of law. By building on our current foundation, we can help safeguard the rule-based international trading system. Last year, bilateral trade between Taiwan and the EU reached $68.7 billion, 32.5% higher than in 2020. Taiwan's offshore wind power and other forms of renewable energy are also making rapid advancement thanks to key investment from European businesses. This would facilitate Taiwan's 2050 goal of net zero emissions as part of our wider efforts to tackle climate change. Recently, 8 Taiwanese companies, including Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, for short, TSMC, founded the Taiwan Climate Partnership. This program aims to lead technology industry toward low carbon transition by building a transparent and accurate database of corporate carbon emissions, setting an agenda for carbon reduction goals, and utilizing digital technologies to increase energy efficiency and low carbon manufacturing. This demonstrates Taiwanese companies' amphibious leadership in fostering a sustainable economy in the global community. Furthermore, Taiwan and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, for short, EBRD, have cooperated on the implementation of the Green Economy Financing Facility throughout Eastern Europe and Central Asia. This is advancing the development of the green economy and encouraging the private sector to invest in such areas as renewable energy, sustainability, and climate recovery. In this past June, Taiwan and EU upgraded our consultation on economic and trade from deputy ministerial level to ministerial level, demonstrating very strong political will from both sides to deepen our economic partnership. In July this year, we would also very delighted to see the European Parliament pass a report on EU's Indo-Pacific strategy for trade and investment. This reiterated support for Taiwan and called on the EU to further promote bilateral economic relations and enhance cooperation on supply chain resilience. This report and the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific have both called for greater cooperation with Taiwan on critical supplies, trade, and investment. Moreover, EU's proposal for global connectivity and the global gateway can effectively implement Taiwan's new southbound policy. The EU has sought to establish more engagement and a partnership with like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific region, including Taiwan. So we do believe a Taiwan-EU bilateral investment agreement, BIA, and a supply chain cooperation agreement could serve as great steps toward a closer partnership between our two sides. We know we are living in dynamic times. As we will work diligently to put the pandemic behind us and confront the challenges posed by authoritarianism, it is more important than ever that Taiwan and EU work together to assist the global community in economic recovery and prevent democratic backsliding. Indeed, the restructuring of global supply chains brings enormous potential for Taiwan and EU to strengthen economic ties even further. In closing, let me once again express my thanks to Mr. Butikofer and all of our European partners for your friendship and support for Taiwan. Let's continue our endeavors to promote the partnership between Taiwan and Europe. I wish all of today's participants very good health and this conference every success. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this enlightening keynote, Minister Tsai. You have demonstrated the wealth of dimensions in which we can enhance the cooperation between the EU, its member states, and Taiwan. Thank you for that service. Thank you also for all your engagement in furthering EU-Taiwan relations in the past and in the present. And we also wish you the best of health and a lot of success in your work. Thanks again very much, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Butikofer. Thank you.
And now we will turn to our second keynote.
And for that, I welcome Dr. Martin Thümmel, Ambassador Thümmel, Deputy Director Thümmel. He carries many hats, but that signals that he is a pivotal person in the German Foreign Office dealing with China and wider Asia. Mr. Thümmel has volunteered to give this keynote today because Petra Sigmund, the Director General, who really wanted to do this, has not been able to come to participate, as she has been called upon by the minister to accompany the minister on her visit to India. So we're all the more grateful, Dr. Thümmel, that you took it upon yourself to give us your keynote. Feel heartily welcome to please come to the podium.
Well, Vice Ministers, Excellencies, Member of European Parliament, meine beautiful members of the Deutsche Bundestag, ladies and gentlemen, I'm truly delighted to be even without a hat at this very important meeting. It's the first in Berlin, I believe, and I would like to say at the outset, you started yesterday, I think, so I'm afraid a lot of what I'm going to say will have been said before, and as one sort of witty German commentator once said of a discussion, everything has been said already, but not by everyone yet. I'll be that person, but I think it's of course of relevance to hear what a representative of the federal government has to say, another foreign minister has to say, so please bear with me. Well, we all know cross-strait relations have taken a turn for the worse, and not just since last August, over the last couple of years. This is due to the behavior of the People's Republic of China. It is very regrettable and dangerous that at the moment no dialogue is taking place between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, and that they come to a complete halt. And we all know, and this is being exacerbated, that Beijing is trying to isolate Taiwan internationally and prevent its participation, for example, in international organizations and other frameworks. I've already mentioned the new climax reached this August after Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And one has to say, this is not a new development, it's been a gradual development, and Taiwan as an important factor, geopolitical factor, predates the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Therefore, again, this is a very timely event, and I'm very happy to be able to participate. It's been mentioned before, but I think this is really important for me to say that in the agreement that tasks the federal government, the so-called coalition agreement, we had Taiwan mentioned for the first time. With these two important elements, no change or any change peacefully and any change of the status quo in mutual agreement. And secondly, the support of this federal government to Taiwan in its justified attempt at meaningful participation in international organizations within the EU's and Germany's One China policy. So this language is not new, but it had not been integrated in the coalition agreement, and we're very grateful to all those who have made sure that it actually came to be. Now, Germany's One China policy, as you know, means we have diplomatic relations only with Beijing and not with Taiwan, which is the policy of all EU member states and the vast majority in the international community. And this framework will remain our framework within which we will conduct relations with Taiwan. But Taiwan is far more than just an economic or cultural partner. It is a value partner, and as the previous speaker, the Vice Minister, has said, it is a democracy, and one has to say it is a leading, or maybe even the leading democracy in Asia. And when you talk about human rights, I think the visit, for example, of our Human Rights Committee of the Federal Parliament, they can attest to that there are actually very few areas. There are always some, there are also some in Germany, where we can find fault with the human rights record of Taiwan. So the record of Taiwan is exemplary in many ways. And this cooperation with our value partners is becoming ever more important in the wake of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Now, about the Beijing approach, as you all know, every time there is a contact, be it parliamentarians, be it federal government representatives, be it statements made within the framework of multilateral institutions, trying to promote the participation of Taiwan. We get confronted by the notion of the PRC, of the One China principle. We steadfastly reject that term and the notion behind that. We have our One China policy, and we do, and I have to reiterate this also in front of this audience, we do really take great store by maintaining the basic pillars of that One China policy. But it is us who have devised this policy, and it is us who interpret this policy, no one else. Now, I think the economic relationship, that's a very obvious case. It's been mentioned before. We have 300 German companies in Taiwan. There's a very vibrant trade and investment relationship. The investment relationship is a little bit one-sided. That, I think, is true for almost all European investors. But I think we're working on, both sides are working on making that a little bit more balanced. There's a very vibrant scientific and academic exchange that will increase simply for the fact that China, the PRC, has closed itself during the COVID pandemic, and nobody knows when they will truly open again. And certain domestic developments, political developments, point to the fact that they will probably not get back to any kind of the level of openness, relative openness, one has to say, they had before the COVID pandemic. Being a Chinese, well, sometimes a Chinese speaker, at least I studied the language in Shanghai, not in Taipei, unfortunately. I know myself that language training in Taiwan for Chinese speakers is still the gold standard. And I hope that in that field and in other fields that our academic exchange will increase. And it is, of course, very helpful that the COVID restrictions that we had in place in Taiwan still until September or late August, early September have been lifted. And this is one of the reasons why we have such an almost explosion of contacts in both directions. Parliamentarians, government representatives here in Berlin and in Taipei. And we should make sure this momentum grows and will not slacken off after a few months. But I'm quite confident that it won't, looking at the calendar of planned further events in the next year or so. Civil society, that's an area where we really want to, I've mentioned already, academic exchange, want to kind of move on to a new level. We're talking to the Taiwanese side on how to best achieve that. It's become very difficult to have any kind of civil society exchange with China, but Taiwan, as I mentioned before, with its democratic, human rights, cultural record and what it has to offer, just on its own merits, really it should be a focus area of activities of that kind. Civil society, government is government, but we will do our bit in trying to get new initiatives off the ground. I've already mentioned the travel restrictions and so on. That's good that that's gone. We are, of course, looking very closely at the developments in the People's Republic of China at the moment. The protests, the attempts at trying to somehow juggle with those and to what extent repression will continue and be increased, but also to the extent that restrictions might be loosened. But the space for maneuver there, in our opinion, is quite limited considering the policies that have been followed within the last 2 years in that field. Talking about the rules-based international order in geopolitical context a bit more. As you know, we're elaborating a China strategy, also tasking in the coalition agreement. It's always important to recall the exact wording of the tasking. And the exact wording of the tasking is, in order to implement our values and interests in the systemic rivalry with China, we need a comprehensive EU-China strategy within the framework of a unified EU-China strategy. And this is the tasking, and that is the tasking we will stick to. And of course, one of the aspects of systemic rivalry is China's behavior in multilateral organizations and dealing with fundamental norms, international law. And here, even in the context of Taiwan, as Taiwanese interlocutors and the experts certainly know, there are attempts to deform rules, deform the system. You all know that China tries to push its own interpretation of Resolution 2587, I think. 2758. I looked it up early in the morning several times, and I tried to remember that. But I should have no problem because I keep getting lectured on that by Beijing authorities. Has its own interpretation and a very selective interpretation. I mean, that was basically to establish the PRC as the sole representative of China in the UN and nothing more. And also very worrying, occasionally we hear comments about the status of waters in the Taiwan Strait, calling into doubt the fact that the international waters in the Taiwan Strait, and so on and so forth. And that is something that we want to push back against more visibly and in a concerted way amongst like-minded. And this is something that I think also is very important to our Taiwanese interlocutors. There is another area, the Indo-Pacific strategy. Well, you know there are Indo-Pacific guidelines by the federal government that came out in 2020. And there was an implementation report that came out just a few months ago, and we're pleased to say that under this new government, the implementation report also mentions Taiwan. And this is, I think, a good example on how national member states and EU institutions can maybe learn from each other a little bit. I would like, because it has been mentioned, say something about economic coercion. Very pleased to see you here, sir. We've been very clear in our encountering publicly and in conversations with the Chinese side and European friends, economic coercion leveled at Lithuania. The situation has not really changed. China has never taken those measures back. And I think beyond the WTO complaint, which is very welcome, it is important, and we're doing our bit in this regard to make sure that such attempts are not successful, which also involves talking to businesses and companies. And I think, by and large, we've had a good record on this. But this will not be the last time, and this will not only be on Taiwan. Therefore, we really hope that, and I think it's looking quite good, that the anti-coercion instrument by the EU, which is a very innovative instrument, will be passed, will be finalized soon. And that's not the only element there is. There is one more aspect I would like to touch upon before I finish. This, of course, only covers and can only cover economic coercion within the EU against EU member states. One important question to work on for us is how to counter economic coercion against Taiwan and against other actors in other world areas that maybe follow a policy in this field that might not be to the liking of Beijing. And of course this has two elements. One element is the countering element. It's basically, can you use WTO procedures? Are there any kind of ways of putting economic pressure on the PRC? This is of course a hugely important discussion within the context of the more dramatic scenarios that we have, if there is a possible escalation. But the other area, and I think this is one area where we can maybe also learn from Taiwan, is how to actually support the victim of coercion, how to make up for losses, possibly. I mean, this is a scenario that you all have probably discussed, the scenario of putting measures into place, be it only political, psychological, but also real ones, to prevent investments from taking place, to restrict trade. So the kind of promotional aspect of the countering in that sense, the positive measures, so to speak, that's an area where I feel we have to actually put much more work, we have to be creative. This is a discussion, quite frankly, that usually does not leave the most kind of theoretical sphere. At least when we talk to colleagues of other governments within the EU. But that's something that maybe also the European institutions, the European Parliament, and so on think about. So some things are already have already been put on the table. The idea of supply chains, a kind of agreement on supply chain security, but that's an important element. In the end, it will be important to have tools in place that really, in a way, move economic assets to where they are being withheld or prevented from reaching Taiwan. So I think I've probably already overshot my time limit here. I think this is pretty much what I would like to cover. It's not everything. Of course, all the positive agenda things, climate protection, biodiversity, global health, all these issues I think have been mentioned before. We look at every area of possible cooperation where we can do more. And on one thing maybe that's important to note and to recall on going back to the so-called guardrails of our One China policy, one sort of point of occasional criticism is the rules we've set ourselves about 40 years ago, a bit longer, that we do not have exchanges at the level of the 7 highest sort of representatives of our state according to our constitution. I would like to put it positively. That just means that up to the level of minister, with the exception of foreign defense and so on, everything is possible. So we have not used that in terms of contacts, meetings and so on, and we have actually not used that space enough in the past. What I'm trying to say is the guardrails are relatively soft and they're quite wide, and we do the interpretations. But I will also say we want to stick to that principle we have mentioned. I know it's also sometimes a hard discussion with stakeholders, also in parliaments on that issue, but also to be kind of quite clear on things we would not want to change by the federal government. And I think I have to also say, because I also have to try and say everything, just to make sure it's not misinterpreted when going back to the China strategy. We will fulfill the task in the government as government itself, which also includes a cooperation, office of cooperation to China, which of course is necessary in many fields. I won't enumerate now because you know them all. Maybe just to talk about one, but climate, just to mention that one. Also here to avoid misunderstandings, climate cooperation with China is a necessity, but it is not the feel-good area of our relationship. I think that has become very clear in Sharm el-Sheikh, how difficult these discussions are, but we see the necessity here and the necessity to make offers, and we will continue to do so. So I think this is pretty much everything I wanted to cover. I'm very glad to be here. I hope you found what I had to say helpful. And the federal government will continue to seek its own contacts and support contacts by others, and to have a much more meaningful and long-lasting relationship with Taiwan on all levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those words, Martin Thümmel. I think everybody in the room and online has been able to detect the direction of Germany's Taiwan policy. And this is a direction that has changed in a positive way when we compare it to former federal governments. And I want to emphasize that. We've also been told about, we call it guardrails, some limitations to that policy. I mean, as a parliamentarian, I maybe have more freedom than people serving in the executive branch of government, so I can also push in moving the guardrails positively. And as we have done with the task that you quoted, for setting the goals for the China strategy, we will also try to work with civil society and the public and the media to move even stronger in the positive direction that you have signaled. And indeed, I would like to emphasize this reminder that you included at the end of your speech, that we have by far not exhausted all the opportunities for stronger relations, even under the rules that we have today. And we should do that. And I'm happy that Petra Sigmund was in Taiwan recently. I'm happy that the Parliamentary State Secretary Franziska Brandner was in Taiwan to strengthen the cooperation, and we will. And I'm also happy that the federal government helped convincing German companies to stick to our common values when it comes to the Chinese coercive efforts against Lithuania. I think you played an important role there also. So thank you again, Mr. Thümmel, for your words. I know that you will have to leave because other duties are calling upon you. Please give our greetings to Petra when she returns. Thanks again. And now I would call on Finnmeier Kukuk to assemble his panel, please.
Yes, welcome to the third panel of our conference. We will pick up directly where Vice Minister Tsai and Deputy Director Thümmel stopped their discussion, because this panel now connects very much and ties into the day-to-day discussions in German politics. As you know, several government agencies and other actors have leaked the several China strategies that are under discussion in Germany right now, and there is a recurring topic. This is reduction of dependencies and resilience of supply chains. Our topic is Taiwan's role in the world economy, and we would like to explore now how Taiwan can have a role for this German policy shift. I will introduce our speakers. We have a very sciencey panel today. We have, I think, assembled the foremost scholars of Taiwan economic relations available not only in Germany but also in Europe. One participant is online. It's a bit unfortunate that I can't see Max Zenglein, but he's visible there behind me. Steffi Weil. I could tell so many things about Steffi Weil. She is a professor at Antwerp University and also at Antwerp Management School. But today she's very special for us because she's co-author of this study on an assessment scoping study for an EU-Taiwan resilient supply chains agreement that was produced by the Green Party in the European Parliament. So she has done a lot of work on our topic very recently. Good to have you here, Professor Weil. Professor Schubert here is a professor for Greater China Studies at Tübingen University, and he also created the research center for, I think, Taiwan-Sino relations also at Tübingen University, and has done extensive research in these fields because he's not only a sinologist but also a politologist. Mathieu Duchâtel is director of the Asia program at Institut Montaigne, a leading think tank in Paris that's mostly supported by private sector, and he was also at ECFR before. He has spent time in Beijing as well as in Taiwan, among these is still at the National Institute of National Defense and Security Research. This sounds very promising. Now, why is it that the people who are connected online are introduced last, but of course not least? Max Zenglein is in Taiwan, so he's our wild card for information from the ground. He's chief economist at our very dear China Research Institute, MERIX, the one and only in Germany. And he does a lot of research on China's economic relations and among these on cross-straits relations. Good to have you all here. Yes, I'd like to start with the ritual of asking each panelist a question on their research field, but Steffi, I'll play the superficial journalist first and ask a question from a very German perspective, because we are in so much trouble with our dependence on China. How can Germany and the EU secure goods from Taiwan in a resilient manner despite all these geopolitical entanglements?
That is a very interesting question. If I could answer that in one sentence, I think I would be rich. No, I have to think. How can we ensure that Taiwanese goods can be imported to the EU and to Germany? I think there are two aspects to it, and I'm very happy actually that we, the speaker before mentioned, we are constrained with the one China policy. So we have to ensure that we open up a dialogue with an actor that is legally constrained. How can we do that? And we, while we were conducting the study, we were really approaching it from a pragmatic perspective, and also my expertise. I'm a Greater China scholar, not particularly focused on Taiwan, but what I also can do is, my research is on how can you make a policy happen? How can you influence a policy? And we looked from a very pragmatic perspective to say, okay, where can Taiwan and the European Union, where can they help each other? And there are many, many policies where really, when we were discussing, we're saying, really, is it that easy? We look, for example, at global health, semiconductors, and there we have to ensure a dialogue in the first step, like really do it in a pragmatic way, and in a second step, we have to implement a legal framework. And that would be, of course, easiest. We say, okay, we go for investment agreement. That is very nice, and that is very supportive, but is this realistic? Because if you look at China, and sorry, Gudrun, I was listening to one of your conversations, we have been talking about an investment agreement for 20 years, and it took forever to make it happen. So to import goods from Taiwan, we should learn from our mistakes. Of course, Taiwan is a completely different actor, with shared values, all of this, but what does that actually mean? So, open up a dialogue and implement the steps we can do on a lower level.
So we'll look at how such a legal framework might look again later. Steffi, you have mentioned semiconductors. Mathieu, you are doing research on the semiconductor trade very specifically. And this is absolutely crucial for anything that's manufactured, also for Western companies, but also for Chinese manufacturers who are producing for the world market. Does having a systemically important company like TSMC that everybody relies on, is that kind of a life insurance for Taiwan?
That's a very good question. Obviously, I think that there are two elements. When you look at the semiconductor industry from the angle of Taiwan security, and you mentioned life insurance, you hear the word Silicon Shield a lot these days, which pretty much means the same. But the two different dimensions are, one, the importance of the semiconductor industry for the arms industry, speaking very realistically in terms of military balance in the Taiwan Strait. And the other one is the position of Taiwan's semiconductor industry in global supply chains, and to what extent this benefits Taiwan's security. So if I may unpack the two, or maybe one of them to start with, and we can talk about the other one later. Speaking first about the contribution of the Taiwanese semiconductor industry to the military balance in the Taiwan Strait. Clearly, the survival of Taiwan as an open society and as a democracy depends first and foremost on a credible deterrence posture. So we should not lose sight of that. And deterrence means being able to deny a PLA victory in case there's a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, and being able to demonstrate the capacity to impose costs. This is more punishment. From these two angles, I think the semiconductor industry makes an important contribution to the military balance between the US and China on the one hand, the two sides of the Taiwan Strait on the other hand. And to understand that, you need to think of defense innovation. The semiconductor industry, in volume, only 1% of the sales go to the arms industry. So it's very small in terms of revenues, but it's very important strategically. And most importantly, it fuels defense innovation. And so on the one hand, the Taiwanese semiconductor industry plays a very important role in preventing the defense innovation capacity of China to upgrade rapidly. And that's very much on the spotlight of everything we are discussing currently, the export control vis-à-vis China and the incessant upgrading of US export control to prevent Chinese military end users from accessing semiconductor technology. And Taiwan was very early on very cautious. I was reading yesterday about the 2001 Economic Development Advisory Conference, which was the early moment when the Taiwanese government made a highly strategic decision to accept investment by the Taiwanese semiconductor industry in China, but to place restrictions on the level of the generations of technologies that the Taiwanese semiconductor industry was basically transferring to China. I think the logic was already then 2 to 3 generations in advance to be maintained. I think that most recently, when the Huawei 5G discussion reached its apex in 2019-2020, there was a temptation in Taiwan to build 2 separate supply chains, one for Huawei, one for the rest of the world. But the way export controls strengthened in the US really resulted in what we are seeing now, which is clearly a coalition to prevent access by the Chinese semiconductor industry and by the Chinese arms industry to state-of-the-art semiconductor technology. I will give you one example to illustrate this point. Think, for example, Alibaba Cloud. Alibaba Cloud is the one company in China that is able to design a 5-nanometer chipset for its cloud servers. So it's really state-of-the-art design capacity. To do that, Alibaba Cloud needs to import GPUs from NVIDIA, so the leading US IC design company. And these chips are being produced by TSMC. Of course, 5 nanometers, only TSMC produces that in volume. But these same chips by NVIDIA are the ones that are being used by the National University of Defense and Technology in China that operates the Tianhe-2 supercomputer. That's clearly dual-use. I think the limit is very clear. The supercomputers, advanced computing capacities, these are about being able to design complex weapon system and also to do complex wargaming. So what do you do as a regulator? How do you ensure that the 5-nanometer chipset that is designed by NVIDIA, produced by TSMC, and procured by Alibaba for its cloud servers do not end up in the supercomputer operated by the PLA? That's the kind of question that are very critical for the semiconductor industry. And on the other hand, of course, if I may, one last point on the arms industry and the importance of the semiconductor industry to the military balance in the Taiwan Strait. Well, on the other hand, Taiwan's defense electronics benefit hugely Taiwan's own arms industry. And if you think just of two systems that play an important role in deterring PLA attack towards Taiwan, the air defense missiles that Taiwan is producing and the anti-ship missiles that Taiwan is producing as well, they rely enormously on Taiwan's strengths in nanoelectronics. So it goes both ways. That's one way of illustrating the contribution of the semiconductor industry to security and stability in the Taiwan Strait.
So weapons are driven by chips. That's also one thing that troubles Russia a lot right now. You're leaving us with huge cliffhangers here. Like you asked the question, how can a regulator prevent NVIDIA chips to end up in dual-use applications? We'll also come back to this later. First, Professor Schubert, China is of course, and China threats are the reason why we are talking about Taiwan and the Taiwanese economy so urgently here. How important now is Taiwan's economy for China? I remember when I worked as an economic journalist in Taiwan, in China, there were Taiwanese managers and Taiwanese businesses everywhere, also behind many things that looked very PRC Chinese at first glance.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I turn the question around. First, say some ground facts about how important the Chinese economy is for Taiwan, because I think that's the more important issue. Just some of the ground facts. I mean, last year, 2021, 28% of Taiwanese exports went to China, and 22% of Taiwanese imports came from China, which is substantial, and which makes China the most important trading partner of Taiwan, far beyond any other partner, including the European Union. And about 50% of Taiwanese FDI end up in China for several years now, and there is no big change in that. So there is a certain decline since 2015. Also, there is a decline in export value, stagnating since 2015. But basically spoken, there is still strong complementarity between the Taiwanese and Chinese economy. And that is not going to change anytime soon, because no matter what the Taiwanese government says, economic actors in the Taiwan Strait, most importantly Taiwanese entrepreneurs, they have their own perspective on China. Now, since some 10 years, Taiwanese companies have relocated to Southeast Asia, particularly labor-intensive industries, of course, because the Chinese economy is structurally changing, it's getting more expensive. But you've also seen a lot of high-value-added business crossing the strait over recent years. And no matter how many companies leave, there is still investment in China from Taiwan, and there is still a huge attraction of the Chinese market for Taiwanese entrepreneurs. There is also much labor migration from Taiwan to China, a topic that I cannot talk about now. Now, what Taiwanese companies do in China is, and you can learn a lot from their economic behavior with respect to maybe other investors in China, they hedge risk, which means that shift parts of their production to out of China, I said Southeast Asia for more labor-intensive parts, but also the United States, if you think of TSMC for instance, but also other companies, and Europe. And the basic logic is that you go into the Chinese domestic market with all the companies that stay in China, and you go out to provide, you deliver to your clients who sit in the United States and in Europe. So it's basically a shifting of investment, accentuation. There is also sensitive R&D getting back to Taiwan. So it's basically a methodology of hedging risk, but the Chinese market remains important. And all the talk of recent years that there would be a full-scale moving out of Taiwanese entrepreneurs of China has not been seen so far, and I think it's not going to happen. So these are some of the ground facts. Some problems are, of course, in that structure. So if you think that some 80% of Taiwan's production in information and communication technologies takes place in China, and that's a consequence of that going out strategy of Taiwanese entrepreneurs in the 90s and early 2010s. And that's very difficult to change because they build up supplier networks in China, and they integrated Chinese suppliers into their networks. So to change that is very, very difficult. And that has actually entailed a certain hollowing out of the Taiwanese economy, not in terms of global export competitiveness, because those Taiwanese companies brought their profit, but it impacts negatively on the Taiwanese economy in terms of decreasing industrial innovation, wage stagnation, and also gross fixed capital formation. So if you're an economist, you will see these are three indicators that indicate danger for the Taiwanese economy, and the Taiwanese government is trying hard to overcome those problems. So last word. There is a lot of risk for Taiwan in China. There are also strategies to control that risk, and the Chinese market remains important for Taiwanese entrepreneurs.
Yes, the most important example that comes to mind is, of course, Foxconn, still running huge operations in mainland China, and we see the risks that are entailed with that. To talk to Max Zenner, you can look at this camera, right? Yes, because China's recent threats, the full-blown war scenarios begin our minds. But yesterday in the first panel, it was stressed that salami tactics, salami slice strategies are much more probable for China to try to get what it wants. And here also the economy comes into play. Max Zenlein, could Beijing use economic pressure to make Taiwan pliable step by step, and what could be the spillover effects for German economy if Taiwan then resists as we would expect it to do? No, Max Zenlein. Good. We are certainly trying to reconnect. I'm always so glad if it's a hybrid event and we don't have to rely on the stream only and I'm not running dry. Europe has a problem, and this is dependence on China, and even countries that have stripped their direct dependence on China, like our dear Lithuanian friends, they still trade with Germany, and here we go, Germany has a huge dependency problem that is almost frightening. So let's now further, in the next round, explore Taiwan's possible role in finding a solution to this conundrum. Procurement is the big topic where Taiwan comes into play. It is not so much Taiwan as a market. So, Steffi Weil, are there currently obstacles in the trade with Taiwan that need to be cleared? It seems to me that relations are actually very, very good.
That's a very good question. Let me think about that. Are there obstacles in trade relations with Taiwan? Let me answer this from my perspective as a political scientist. And yes, of course, there are obstacles because Taiwan is an actor you cannot put under the same framework than other democratic nation states, of course, but Taiwan is a democracy. So what is the biggest obstacle? That we don't have the trade regulations institutionalized now. So I think we should really draw on mechanisms and build upon this to really find a common framework. If we think about licensing, we think about medical equipment, there is a big opportunity for Europe, for Germany, to export to Taiwan. But we need a framework, and I was also last night thinking about, we shouldn't make the same mistakes than with China. The framework should be clear, should be discussed, and we should be sure that there are European rules and regulations to be implemented, that we are not lagging behind the US. Because if we have licensing that are based on the US, then it doesn't really help for Europe. And procurement in general, of course, we shouldn't turn a blind eye. We still have to follow, European standards, and also if we look at the Taiwan market, the EU should be very clear with defining and doing the checks, what is that, the check, also of Taiwanese companies, dealing with Europe. So, but yeah, it sounds very negative, but of course there are a lot of obvious it's much easier to deal with a Taiwanese partner than with China. And we have a long history of lessons learned, so we can deal with that.
So we would still need a contract, a framework to improve Taiwan-European ties. This is your point.
Of course, like with any other actor. Yeah, it would be actually weird if we don't have a framework with Taiwan.
The one thing that could help the EU and Germany most right now is probably transferring Taiwan high-tech production to Germany, or luring them to the EU to a certain extent. So my questions for both Mr. Duchatel and Mr. Schubert is, what are our prospects for that? For example, TSMC, semiconductors. Is it realistic at the moment to lure TSMC here to build a big plan for the most advanced chips, or even for the not so advanced chips that the car industry needs?
Well, I think the discussions are still ongoing. It's not 100% from a Taiwanese perspective about trade opportunities and profit making. I think there is a political dimension to some degree, and there is also the long-term perspective of the resilience of the Taiwanese semiconductor industry, and beyond that, the question of Taiwan's security. And here I want to make one point. I think there are two possible perspectives on being part of the global supply chain for Taiwan. One is interdependence really benefits us, and the other one is more, we are an indispensable player in the global supply chain. So either interdependence or indispensability. And the Taiwanese policy documents do not use the word indispensability. If you look at the Japanese economic security legislation, that's the key concept. We need to remain indispensable in some niche areas of the global supply chains to remain relevant, and this is about also a national strategy. But I think that in practice, the Taiwanese mindset regarding semiconductors is more indispensability than deepened interdependence. And that's, I think, a reason why TSMC has been, in fact, extremely cautious and to some degree reluctant to expand overseas. If you watch the debates regarding TSMC's investment in Arizona, they are not as positive as one might expect, given the ambition of the project and the strategic relevance of the project for both the US and Taiwan. I think Taiwan is to be expected to manage its indispensability. Indispensability is the state of affairs currently. TSMC represents 60% of global sales of foundry products, so it's really huge. Everyone needs it. But I would not expect, and I think the debate regarding TSMC's investment in Germany is very much colored by that dimension. That does this really benefit Taiwanese security? Can we simply approach this from the perspective of market shares in the European automotive industry, which is the way it is framed by some? So purely in commercial terms, I think that's not the way Taiwan approaches those investments. And another thing to keep in mind is that for a company like TSMC, which has been by identity, greater China for its production capacities, and still 20% of TSMC's sales go to China today, and TSMC runs production facilities in China, which are being expanded despite all the tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Building a fab in Arizona and building another fab in Japan is clearly a major change of scale for a company like TSMC, and it's a change of strategy. So I think the priorities are clear: US, Japan, maybe next. But I think that this would need to be embedded in a larger, in a deepened relationship between Taiwan and the European Union. Maybe one last short point on this. If it happens, if TSMC ran a fab in Germany, it would come with its chain of Taiwanese suppliers. I mean, it would make a huge difference in the EU-Taiwan economic relationship.
So it is not a no-brainer for TSMC to invest abroad. We would have to give something back, maybe. Professor Schubert, what would this be? What could make our locations more attractive for Taiwanese companies?
Well, I cannot speak so much about the semiconductor industry. As far as I know, I fully agree to what you say. The degree of cautiousness to go into European and also US business, I've also seen in other industrial sectors. So again, the threat of China may be very high for economic actors in Taiwan. Asia is closer and China is closer than Europe and the United States. And for those companies who have invested for decades now in the Chinese mainland, and they have survived that sharp basing of the Chinese market, and they are profitable, it's absolutely no question to leave China. That's my own experience. I've talked about 500 Taiwanese entrepreneurs of all sectors over recent years. And that's what is the message. Huge pressure, but if we can survive on that market, we're going to stay. Europe and the US are important in the sense that we hedge risk. Now, what risk are we supposed to hedge? There is also a lot of pressure on the part of Western companies, on Taiwanese, procurators, so to say, companies, to go out of China to secure their supply chains and to make production safer. But as far as those companies I know tell me, this pressure is still not so high that they are really forced to go out of China. That may change over the next years, but for the time being, American companies demand from Taiwanese companies to have Plan B or Plan C, but not directly force them to go out of China. So this might change over the next years, but right now it's not like that. In a nutshell, what can we do? We are important for political reasons, I would say. I'm not convinced that we are so important in economic terms, but of course politics tops the economy here, and Taiwanese companies would do what it takes to have closer economic relations with Europe and also the US in order to hedge the risk in China. But the independent variable is China, it's not Europe and it's not the US.
Part of the European pitch could be that Taiwan is actually in the same conundrum as the EU, that they are too dependent on China, and Europe could be a big part of their diversification strategy.
Let's turn to Max in Taipei, who can hopefully hear me. Can you please nod if yes? Oh, that's great. Yes, the audience has heard my question to you already. It's about Salami's nice
strategies to make Taiwan more pliable. We have talked about Taiwan dependence on the People's Republic. We have heard a lot about this already here. Could China use this leverage to make Taiwan pliable without using force? What is your take on that?
Of course, and I think China has been, still very constrained on the types of economic coercion that have been, or they've implemented towards China. And I think when we talk about Taiwan, we have a lot of focus on the semiconductor industry. We look maybe at the trade figures of, over 40% of Taiwanese trade going to China, most of that being semiconductor. And I think we need to look beyond that, because also if you look at semiconductor, China is not the end market for all of these exports. So they use, semiconductors go into a lot of electronics that go to global markets. So I think that is less such of a vulnerability, but nonetheless, we've had economic coercion in, let's say, also non-strategic sector that would not affect China. So we've had it in agriculture and the like, which are mostly symbolic. It's not very relevant for the Taiwanese economy. Nonetheless, it hits these sectors fairly hard. But I think there is still potential that China expands the extent of economic costs that are felt more wider across the Taiwanese society. So just examples, there could be efforts to some form of disruption of supply chains that trigger inflation, that make it more difficult for Taiwanese companies in Taiwan to operate, and that might try to paint a picture that Taiwan is basically uninvestable for foreign companies and is not a reliable partner in global supply chains. So I think there's measures that can be taken that would have an economic costs. The question is how China would actually begin to enforce this, and what the consequences all of this with this or would be for Taiwanese position. So I do think, while we're talking a lot about these war scenarios, these are the type of economic vulnerabilities that we will have to think about in such scenarios.
Have you also looked at the possible repercussions for German companies in such a scenario? Because German companies are so much entwined with the Chinese market.
Well, I think firstly, it's important to understand that any Taiwan risk is not isolated to Taiwan, and it would also increase risks for any European investments or business ties with China. And the political signaling by the Chinese side will be very clear. There will be an expectation that companies fall in line. So I think this is something, these are scenarios companies, politicians need to prepare for in order to also signal what type of response would be in case of such extended use of economic coercion when it comes to Taiwan.
So to sum up this first round of our discussion, I'd say we can state that China and the EU have a common problem, which is China and dependence on China, and a lot could be done for that. Steffi Weil, you picked up your microphone.
No. I was just, I was just wondering because I have a couple of questions or thoughts because if we are thinking of moving out production out of China, investing in Germany, I think this is a very radical step. So in my mind, is it even feasible, or is it something that is feasible within the coming years? So I was wondering if we shouldn't try to strengthen the Taiwanese economy or the Taiwanese environment, that we don't have this kind of doom scenarios, that Taiwan is not a country where companies cannot invest. Wouldn't that be like the most logical or more easy step to go? Of course, there are interdependencies, and also with mainland China. But this is something we cannot, how should I put it? We cannot deny. I think we can see that we minimize, but we cannot erase China as an actor. We should see that we get it stable in combination with Taiwan, because as there are also dependencies of Taiwan, to China.
Can I add a thing? So we also have to see that the Chinese change their economic model. They do everything to get a strong domestic market. And we know from big economies that a strong domestic market is highly attractive. So there is still a lot of capacity also for Taiwanese companies on the Chinese market if that model plays out. And that is also something that Taiwanese entrepreneurs would tell you. I mean, this is a market that is still in the process of developing. We have a lot of products here that we can sell very well. So we have to take this market into consideration, and that over the long term. Now, the Taiwan government tries to also help Taiwanese entrepreneurs or induce Taiwanese entrepreneurs to diversify by this new southbound policy. But if you look at the economic impact of the new southbound policy, there are many positive impacts on that in the social realm, in the people-to-people realm. But in terms of in economic terms, the impact is much more limited, because the government is not very successful in convincing entrepreneurs to change a strategy of profit just because of political considerations. And that's basically what the new southbound policy is about. So it's a good policy. It's much better than all the other southbound policies have been in the past, what the Tsai government does since 2016, but it cannot really change the tide of economic decision making on the part of Taiwanese entrepreneurs in grosso modo.
the dual circulation is more successful than many actors initially thought, it seems, so far. What are China's chances to get independent of Taiwanese semiconductors? What do you think, Mathieu Duchatel?
Well, that's an interesting one. Two things here. I mean, first, the long-term prospects of the automotive industry not to face shortages anymore depends to some extent of the success of TSMC's expanded fab in China. I think this is happening as we are speaking. I think the interconnection between the Chinese and the Taiwanese semiconductor industry has been in the form of Taiwanese investment in mainland China, clearly, but also in the form of many attempts by China to basically access Taiwanese know-how and technology. And here, I think that the restrictive policies of the Taiwanese government and also the cooperation between Taiwan and other key partners, especially the US, is really curbing the flow. And we're seeing this in the area of people-to-people exchanges. Actually, the Taiwanese government in the past 2 years has been very active in trying to prevent recruitment of engineers and also executive managers, and there's been a crackdown basically against intermediary companies that were conducting recruitment in Taiwan. And I think the third point is that the export control regulations really have an impact. And to really understand that, I think that the key notion here is the notion of virtuous circle innovation. So think Chinese ambitions to mass produce 7 nanometer semiconductors. During the summer, we learned that SMIC, which is the leading Chinese foundry, had managed to produce a prototype of that technology, which is a very, very interesting development. But if you are not accessing the software that you need, if you are not accessing the lithography tools that you need, it's very difficult to keep up the pace of innovation. So from another angle, think TSMC's 3 nanometer production. It has partners and it does not innovate independently. It's a whole ecosystem which the Chinese industry is currently prevented from accessing. So in other words, I think that there are two simultaneous realities. One is that China's footprint in mature nodes of technology will increase, and this has an impact on the automotive industry very much. The Chinese semiconductor industry is becoming increasingly important for the world's automotive industry. And on the other hand, the innovation is happening to some degree without China, at least for the leading edge nodes and for everything that is related to defense and that ultimately can end up in the arms industry. So two separate paths in a way.
Doesn't that give momentum for Europe or for Germany to be a strong player in this ecosystem, no?
But it goes both ways. This also explains the integration of the Chinese and the German automotive industries. So it really goes both ways.
So it seems that supply chains are really splitting worldwide, and it's a bit comforting to know that Taiwan is in our sphere, and there will be a separate, different supply chains in China, very possibly, if the geopolitical tensions rise more. There should be two scenarios in our heads. One is the fine weather scenario, the status quo scenario, where we can fight a bit about details, and the other is the disaster scenario. And it didn't loom large in our minds before February 24th, but it seems much more possible and real now that disaster has already happened in Europe. So I don't think we can avoid talking about this. Max Zenglein, if there is a nasty thing like a sea and air blockade of Taiwan, which, as we have learned from Mr. Duchatel, makes 60% of semiconductors worldwide, I think it is over 90% if it is high-end chips. What would happen to Europe and US if these exports from Taiwan are lost? Just not in the big war scenario, but in a serious conflict scenario. Questions for you, Max Zenglein.
Yes. Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, if the supply of semiconductors is disrupted, it won't just be a problem for Europe, it would be a problem for China as well. So I think there's different scenarios that China will deploy in terms of blockade scenarios. So, I mean, primarily I would think about disrupting the energy supply that I mentioned before, but they will try to affect or implement a blockade that minimizes the direct economic impact on China itself. So I think it would be very difficult for China to implement a blockade that would actually hit European interests without affecting China. So I think any form of blockade will primarily focus on affecting the Taiwanese economy and basically adding or increasing the pressure within the Taiwanese business community, within the Taiwanese business or within the Taiwanese society to understand the economic costs and test the resolve of Taiwanese Taiwanese position in terms of the cross-strait relations. So I think it will be very difficult to implement such a semiconductor blockade of such. So I don't think that's a very likely scenario.
In case of the real aggression against Taiwan, what chain of events would ensue? Maybe I ask the two professors that have a international relations part of their field. Professor Weil.
Also, looking at my colleague here, security specialist, I would also be
total EU sanctions against China a realistic reaction.
Repeat the question again.
Yes, if the bad thing happens and there's an invasion of Taiwan, God forbid, and it maybe sounds a bit cynical that we are only talking about the economic aspects, but this is the topic of this panel. So would you think it is possible, realistic, that EU has the power, the will, and resolve and the means to put sanctions against China into motion?
I mean, as we have seen with Russia, I think if we have to, of course, we will find a way to put sanctions, definitely. And I think also that the Ukraine invasion also was a little bit like a wake-up call. It's like, okay, we have to be less dependent on China. And this is something that's very noble to say. But to put sanctions overnight, of course, it is not easy. And let me say, yeah, of course, we are talking about the economy, but this always goes hand in hand with politics. So it's not only an economic issue we are discussing here, it's also political. So I think we need to be prepared. I'm not saying there is an invasion coming, but in general, to be less dependent on China, and Taiwan can be a crucial player in this. So, I mean, let's not home. I mean, I'm not one of the actors that say, okay, we are in these doom scenarios and there will be a war coming. So, but I think in general, to further think about this, yes, we need to be less dependent, and yes, Taiwan can be a crucial player in this.
Mr. Habeck's ministry put a date on this, 2027. It was in the public. It was perceived a bit like a prophecy. It was meant as a worst case scenario that German economy should be prepared for, and there's no way at all that decoupling happens before 2027, and probably doesn't make sense because we don't know what's going to happen. So we we can kill ourselves in fear of death. But still, let's take 2027. Mr. Schubert, all these arguments against a war are also discussed in Beijing. The economic fallout would be so massive, it would actually forbid this, the decision to do so, right?
No.
Well, all analysis, at least by Western scholars on the 20th Party Congress, and the careful reading of all the documents and the statements of Chinese leaders during that Congress, point at the assumption that there will be no big fuss before 27. And maybe not even beyond that. And we are scholars; we cannot speculate on what's going to happen. I think also the question on how the European Union is going to deal with that is more a question for Mr. Bütikofer, who probably knows the dynamics in the European Parliament, but particularly in the Council much better. I mean, you sound very optimistic that the feeling of pushing back against China is becoming stronger. I don't know. From a scholarly perspective, I would be more, pessimistic in terms of the council. But then again, I'm not within the apparatus, and you know much better. So I don't know. At least for the time being, I would say there are more hints at, no change in Beijing's policy over the next years, but you never know.
And just very clear, sorry, and also in this worst case scenario, I think the EU wouldn't be alone. And then you are in a network also with the US, who would support and also support Taiwan, in a war scenario. So to ask, okay, is it only the EU? I think the EU wouldn't stand alone in such a case.
You hear sometimes 2024 as a reaction to the elections in Taiwan, 2027, 2030, 2035. I think none of these assessments is based on an understanding of the actual intentions of the Communist Party in Beijing. I think it's based either on an evaluation of the capacities of the PLA, that's for 2027, or that's based on a scenario of disruption. And so in a way, I think that talking about dates and timelines is not particularly helpful. That's my first point. The second point is below the threshold of amphibious assault, invasion of Taiwan, there are many gray zone scenarios that have a huge impact on the world economy. Some of us in this room were presented with a Rhodium Group study, which was not published, but which basically tries to assess the costs of blockade. I think the thinking behind the study was we have to start somewhere to evaluate the possible cost of a Taiwan Strait contingency. So they picked a blockade, and the scenario did not include a Taiwanese response and did not include the US response. It was just the cost of the blockade. And very interestingly, this showed that the disruptions of the semiconductor supply chain, plus the disruption of stock market value as a result of panic in the financial markets, would have huge consequences for Europe within a matter of days. So, whichever way you look at it, the security of the Taiwan Straits and the gray zone contingency scenarios are very much linked to the prosperity of Europe. That's my second point. And maybe third point on sanctions. Many in the US and in Japan think that the restrictions regime that we built together in a matter of days after the invasion of Ukraine provides a blueprint for Taiwan scenario in terms of complete blockade of exports of dual-use technologies, going way beyond the existing control lists, so extremely ambitious. We have an export control working group within the TTC with the US. I think it's what really imports here, in my opinion, is the communication to the Chinese side that there is determination on the European side to respond with costs. I think it's very important for maintaining stability in the Taiwan Straits that there is an assessment in Beijing that this goes that way. I'm not sure that we're sending the right signals right now.
At this point, we'd actually need a panel participant from BDI, the German Industry Association, to ask them if these risks are properly understood in German economy. But we have no one here, and as you said, it's not the job of scholars to speculate. I'd like to give things a more optimistic turn now, and in the final round of this discussion, let's explore how the economy can play a role in preventing such a scenario. Max Zenglein.
So the camera just switched, but I'm assuming the question was on what businesses can do to prevent such a worst case scenario. I mean, that's a very ambitious task for the business community to resolve. To be honest, I think much of the potential scenarios are really out of the hands of business. They can provide scenarios how to deal with certain risks. But let's say if I would have any advice, I think while we're talking also a lot about reducing dependencies and decoupling, I do think by maintaining very interdependent supply chains, including with Hong Kong and China, with Europe, that may be one of the most stabilizing factors we can have. And at the moment, what I'm most concerned is that companies will tell you they do not want to decouple. It's not in their interest, while they're onshoring more high tech into China and de facto decoupling. That I think is a very dangerous pathway. I think we need to find measures that this doesn't happen to that degree, that we maintain global integration as much as possible, and that we also safeguard Taiwan's role in these global supply chains.
That's an interesting one. So in order to prepare for the worst case, we have to decouple. But in order to prevent the worst case, we have to keep economic relations tight. We can't do both at the same time, right, Professor Schubert?
Well, that's a very liberalist perspective, and I subscribe to that. I mean, if you listen to Chinese and Taiwanese scholars, but also policymakers, they would tell you, we are talking about the periphery of China. We're not talking about Europe. We are not talking about the US. We are talking about South Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Central Asia. That's what we Chinese consider our periphery, and that's the space we want to integrate and connect. And many Taiwanese would just buy into that and say, well, that's exactly what we need for stabilizing our economy long term. And so there is a huge drive, I would say, on the part of many sides in the region, that no matter what kind of problems there are with China, but it's still the economy stupid. Yeah, and we have to know this in Europe. We play a role, an important role. I agree fully to that in terms of technology transfer, and that's the same for the US. But there is also an understanding in East Asia that this is a huge market that needs to be integrated, and that's the future of that region. And in terms of conflict, I think I fully agree to this standpoint. The only chance we have to reduce conflict is to keep integration at a high level with all the risks. I think decoupling bears more risk. This does not mean that one has to be naive and not protect his or her own technologies. But if you think into, a separation of supply chains out of a highly integrated economy, I think in the end you produce much more conflict than you produce stability.
So you're not a fan of the drafts of the China strategies that are circulating?
Well, I can. Again, it's a very complicated problem. Parts of it, I think, are important, but other parts are maybe too much. And we are now in a state of discussion. It's a state of, it's a stage of transition. We still have to, need to discuss about the consequences that Dr. Duchatel, for instance, just mentioned. And this is something that we cannot really do too quickly.
At the same time, the Chinese have the same debates. I mean, the Chinese discuss about their own vulnerability, how they have to protect themselves, but how they have to keep a global integration at the level where they can really have a future. I mean, the same discussion that we have here, they have there. So I think, why not talking a little bit together against all the odds? Yeah.
We have heard already that so many Chinese products are not possible without Western contribution and Taiwan contribution, including military or aerospace products, even the civilian ones. Mr. Duchatel, should the EU rather use strategic ambiguity toward China or draw a red line and say, if you do this, then there will be sanctions?
Well, my personal opinion on this is that we should first be really clear about our contingency planning. What are the consequences of various scenarios? And I think that some of the reactions for each scenario should be communicated to the Chinese side through diplomatic channels. I don't think that this should be, made public. I know that many people have different opinions about that being public acts as deterrence. I think that clarifying what would be the reaction of the Europeans A, B, C, D should be communicated directly to the Chinese side.
The disadvantage is, of course, if you can't make your promise true, then you lose credibility.
No, I just wanted to add to you and also to you in terms of, okay, transparent what we can do and what we cannot do.
Is like-mindedness an economic factor after all? For many decades, it was more like the economy transcends political systems, and the big corporation were doing the
global business being in Russia and in Arabia and
China, without so much looking at system differences. But it seems that like-mindedness and a sense of friendship becomes a hard economic factor again.
I think we never neglected the political system. There was always a lot of awareness that we are dealing with another partner. If you're thinking about China, and yesterday it was mentioned. I remember I mentioned change through trade, Wandel durch Handel in one of my articles, and it was completely chopped. It's like it's been 20 years, and why is this mentioned? I think it should be mentioned that the political system plays a role, and we cannot say, okay, we just trade. But also, and I have to say, yesterday it was mentioned like that like-minded partner. What does that actually mean? Because, and I want to repeat because I liked it very much. A democracy doesn't mean that we are just like-minded partners, because we have to find a common ground. And there we have momentum with Taiwan, because Taiwan is very open to listen and to integrate, and also to see, and there's this big debate, the EU as a normative actor. And I think the EU should be a normative actor and should open up, with trade, and to integrate these kind of normative values into agreements. So yes, it does play. It's intertwined.
Is there input from the audience? This is just an open question, but I know there's a lot of China and Taiwan competence in the room. So I'd be very happy to lend my mic, because that's the easiest way to do it, to anyone.
Thank you very much for the microphone. My name is Christy Su. I'm from Taiwan. I'll quickly respond to two points that have been discussed. The first is, why does TSMC not thinking of coming to EU or coming to Germany? I think the fact is that most of TSMC's investment plans in Japan and also in Arizona are actually market driven. That means that they have clients, either the US clients Europeans or the Japanese client ask them to invest. Plus, Japanese and U.S. government provide very generous subsidy. And however, with all this support, TSMC still faces a lot of challenges in investing in Arizona and also in Japan. For the case of Arizona, TSMC has problem to recruit sufficient talent for its operation, and also TSMC cannot bring all together their key suppliers going with them. I think that relates to the notion you mentioned about this ecosystem. So in Germany or any other European member state wants to have TSMC coming here, you have to create an environment that can help develop the ecosystem of the semiconductor. For example, in the US, there's no advanced packaging and testing. That means for even TSMC produce advanced chips there, they have to send all the way these chips back to Asia for testing and packaging, and then send them back to the US. And I wonder whether you have that kind of capacity. So that is the first thing. And the second is about a decoupling issue. I think in Taiwan, people don't start talking about decoupling, economic decoupling, but we do see decoupling of supply chain, which is the China-centered supply chain vis-a-vis the China-free or less China component supply chain. I think that is the reality we have to face. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes. If it depends on IT talent being available on the labor market, this is not a good prospect for Taiwan investments in Germany.
Hello, Teresa Novotná. I am a Czech academic based here at Free University of Berlin. Quick question about the European Chips Act. How does it play in this independence and supply chains and so on? Can Europe become much more independent also from Taiwan? And second question, we've talked a lot about diversification from China and European independence, but then you have credibility in the eyes of Taiwanese when it comes to diversification. Thank you.
Yes, who would like to answer? What do deals like Costco or now the expansion of Volkswagen's investment in China do to credibility of the EU, because Germany is the largest EU member state?
Well, I can only report what I hear in Taiwan on that, and it depends, as always, to whom you talk. If you talk to policymakers in Taiwan, they would, of course, not be very happy about that. But then again, they are also very cautious and would tell you this is a German government decision. And I think that's also a smart move. The Taiwanese government is very smart in not really giving advice. And I think that's also policy line over there. You just let the Europeans sort that out themselves. We are trying to make good use of the opportunities we have, but we do not give pressure and make a difference to China, even if we have the normative good end on our side right now. If you talk to business people, many would tell you, what's the problem with a 24% stake of a Chinese company in a German container terminal? There's a World Bank report of 2018, I think, is showing you how many European American companies have invested in Chinese ports, something many people do not know. Quite substantial investments across the board in China. So in a way, this is also quite distorted discussion here, right? But I'm not saying that you need accept that. It's the same point that Dr. Duchatel said. We have to, define what our positions are. We need principles. And if we have principles, we have a strategy. And if we have a strategy, we have a concise response to this kind of investment. Right now, we don't have it. And that's why it's all of us. The whole discussion is very controversial and there is no unison voice. And that's the problem.
Maybe even the second best strategy is better than no strategy, right?
whatever is to have a strategy would be a good thing.
One of my colleagues who specialized in logistics, and he said, you know, I don't understand the fuss about it. And then we have to think about the narrative we have. I don't know. I don't know. I cannot really judge. But there, we, you know, what kind of damage does it have? I think we should work on, you know, the disinformation or the information that is out there, and we should be very clear, you know, beyond the strategy we are having.
Yeah, the great shock was realizing in March that Rosneft and Gazprom are managing German gas reserves. I think after that,
I'm talking about Costco. No, I'm talking about Costco. I mean, and that was, I mean, it's not like that we didn't know the dependency before. Yes, of course.
Maybe I can answer the question about the CHIPS Act, and also thank you, Dr. Xu, for your points about TSMC. And I think it's related. I think the CHIPS Act really enables what we are discussing this morning, the possible investment by TSMC in Germany. Without state aid, this would not be possible. And all the points you made regarding the commercial viability of these investments, we hear that the cost of producing 5-nanometer semiconductors in the US is 50% higher than in Taiwan. I haven't seen any evaluation about the gap in costs between production in Europe and production in Taiwan. But the CHIPS Act is designed so that state aid can be provided to make up exactly for the gap in production costs. And I think, in fact, that TSMC is also watching how this works in practice, because we have currently 2 cases of foundry investments in Europe under the CHIPS Act modalities. One is Intel in Germany, and the other one, Global Foundries in France. So that's really the first time, and it's a new development for the European Union that state aids are being accepted by the competition under European competition law. That's the first point. The second point is that Taiwan is explicitly listed as a partner for supply chain resilience under the CHIPS Act, alongside a number of other countries that are Singapore, South Korea, Japan, and the US, but not China. I think it's a political decision to also, focus political efforts on deepening exchanges with Taiwan in that area. How this can work in practice, I mean, your report develops this idea. I think clearly when you look at the US-EU Semiconductor Working Group under the Trade and Technology Council as a benchmark for what can be achieved in terms of political interactions surrounding the semiconductor industry. Clearly, the easiest part is early warning system for supply chain disruption, which in itself is important. And that's a lesson from the COVID-19 and Huawei crisis-induced shortages in 2020. Too many orders, a lot of confusion, etc. If you want to avoid a similar scenario to play out again, you need some political channels to see where the bottlenecks are and to be able to understand when this is happening. So this is very concrete, I think, for the EU and Taiwan to work together.
What a nice word towards the end. It's so important to work together between EU and Taiwan, also economically. With this, I would conclude our discussion. Thanks again for the 4 marvelous scholars who shared their insights with us today. Thanks to the audience for listening. And yes, we are looking forward to a break now, right? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very honored to host the last panel of this very interesting conference. And over the past 2 days, we talked about a range of issues. We talked yesterday about Taiwan's democracy, about Taiwan's digital democracy and the approach to disinformation. This morning about Taiwan's role in global supply chains. And now I hope to tie all those threads a little bit together when we talk about Taiwan as a partner. So a few thoughts from my side. What do we mean with partnership? So the first thing that comes to my mind is reciprocity. We heard throughout the past 2 days that offer be like the semiconductor industry, the lesson of the democracy, or its approach to cognitive warfare. And the second thing that I'm talking about a partner, in German we use the expression equal footing. So how can we interact auf Augenhöhe? This panel will center around or touch upon a range of questions. For example, like how can we benefit from a partnership with Taiwan? Or even one step further, why is it important for us to cooperate and to work closely with Taiwan in securing peace and security in the Indo-Pacific? Also, what are opportunities and challenges for enhancing Taiwan's role as a partner in the Indo-Pacific? And what are potential next steps for a meaningful engagement with Taiwan within existing boundaries like the One China policy? Those are some of the questions this panel will touch upon, and I'm very happy that I have 4 experts here. Yes, with a very diverse background. On my left is Christy Xu. Christy is the Director of ASEAN Studies Center at the Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research. She advises the Taiwan government and business associations on economic diplomacy, trade and investment issues, including bilateral trade agreements, regional trade blocs, and the new southbound policy. Christy is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation and a member of the International Affairs Advisory Council of Taipei City Government. Then we have Zhuja Anaferenzi. Zhuja is currently a Taiwan Fellow hosted by the Ministry of Science and Technology, and she's also an assistant professor at the National Donghua University in Hualien. She's also head of the Associate Network of 9 Dash Line and a research fellow at Taiwan Next Gen Foundation, and her research focuses on EU foreign and security policy, EU nominative power, and EU relations with China and Taiwan. Then we have Gary J. Schmidt joining us from Washington, D.C. Gary is a senior fellow in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute, and he works on issues related to the American presidency, the U.S. Constitution and principles, and U.S. national security topics. And then we have John Fitzgerald joining us from Canberra. John is a professor emeritus at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, and there he directed the Asia-Pacific Philanthropy Program from 2013 to 2017, and he's also an external contributor to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So just to give you a brief overview, we will start with 3-minute statements from our panelists on the topic, Taiwan as a partner in the Indo-Pacific, opportunities and challenges. And then we will follow that up with moderators' questions and then a hopefully vibrant audience Q&A. Christy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll start with a little bit introduction of the New Southbound policy, as mentioned earlier. The New Southbound policy actually covers 18 countries. Most of them are the Indo-Pacific countries. That was adopted by President Tsai in 2016. And after 7 years of implementation, we already witnessed a lot of accomplishments in terms of several areas. The first, and I can categorize this accomplishment into several diversification. That means diversification in export markets, diversification in import source, diversification in outbound investment, and also diversification in inbound tourism and also students. So having said that, I think 2 very outstanding accomplishments I need to share with you is that for the first thing is the diversification of our outbound investment into the world. As earlier session touched upon Taiwan's vulnerability with regards to its too much concentration in Chinese market. However, with the implementation of the new southbound policy, in 2010, China, our investment going to China accounts around 84% of our total investment. That means every $100 we invested, actually $85 went to China. But after this adoption of this new southbound policy, and also because thanks to the U.S.-China trade conflicts, and also Taiwanese companies' awareness of this increasing geopolitical like-minded partners in this region and also in other parts of the world, which we have never seen that kind of close ties before. Thanks to Taiwan's awareness, Taiwanese companies' awareness that they need to diversify their business and also diversify their counterparts. So these are the two elements under the new southbound policy. So the government right now is actually trying to expand the new southbound policy to better respond to the Indo-Pacific strategy. By doing that, actually, Taiwan and U.S. government have launched a series of projects, including the global cooperation and training framework, which where Taiwan and U.S. government jointly provide training programs to Southeast Asian countries and South Asian countries, and also some Latin American countries. That also includes the training program on disinformation, I think 2 years ago. And also, Taiwan has also worked with India, also with Japanese government to respond to their separate Indo-Pacific strategy. For example, Taiwan and Japanese government created Taiwan-Japan committee exploring third country market. By doing that, actually Taiwan and Japan combine their respective ODA strategy capacities in focusing on providing infrastructure projects in new southbound policy country and also other countries in other parts of the world, and with a target especially on high-speed rail and biotechnology, medical industry, and also environment. So I think with that regard, Taiwan is actually working with different partners in which have their own Indo-Pacific strategy, and so that we can synergize our efforts together.
Thank you, Christy. I'll directly hand it over to you, Zhuzha.
Thank you, Tatiana, and thank you for the invitation to be included in this panel. I think already yesterday we've touched upon a lot of the issues that us being sitting here in the last panel gives us the privilege to sort of touch upon a lot of the things, but also to add new elements from a different light. So I would like to take your question, whether Taiwan and how can we work with Taiwan as a partner. And I would just like to make a main argument here that Taiwan is already a reliable, robust, and a resilient partner, as this is something, not a controversial statement, but I think this is part of the internationalization of Taiwan as a partner within the context of the Indo-Pacific. And I think this allows us to look for opportunities for cooperation. And I think that's also the title of the conference, right? How can we strengthen and look for further opportunities? So I think in the context of internationalizing Taiwan, we can discuss how we can normalize Taiwan as a partner for like-minded partners. From the European perspective, of course, the Indo-Pacific provides that framework, I believe, that is rooted in this change in perception of Taiwan as a partner, as a like-minded partner. And I think this is something that brings us closer to other countries in the region, such as Japan and Australia and India. And this is where I would switch to the idea of minilateral cooperation, because I think this is a platform that allows flexibility and practical cooperation that is not politicized. So I think we really need to be very practical about how we can further integrate Taiwan in regional frameworks, economic cooperation frameworks. And I think, as it was said in the earlier panel, I think we need to be very realistic about the boundaries that we have. So I think as I am based in Taiwan and I look at EU-Taiwan cooperation, I think it is important to remind our partners that our framework, the framework within which Europe engages Taiwan, remains the one China policy. But the change that we see is the willingness of European partners to assert our right to cooperate with Taiwan as a partner. And that's where I would really signal the change and the momentum and the opportunity that if we have this willingness that is being articulated in the European institutions, in particular the European Parliament, this is something that both sides need to work on. So perhaps I can elaborate more on how we go from the process of internationalizing Taiwan into normalizing Taiwan as that reliable partner. Of course, the key word that we covered already in the previous panel was deterrence, resilience, and ways to find platforms that allow that in a practical way. So I would like to also come back to the GCTF. I think that's where we need to really get practical. So I'm happy to come back and elaborate further in the Q&A or in the follow-up questions.
Thank you, Zhu. Gary.
Thanks. First, I want to start off by just congratulating Reinhardt and his team for a wonderful conference. I've been talking about Taiwan and China for 25 years now, and just to sort of put everything in perspective, 20 years ago, if I was to go to a conference, first of all, you probably wouldn't have a conference on Taiwan 20 years ago. So there's been a remarkable sea change, and everybody should, in this room in particular, should pat themselves on the back for being able to talk about these issues in a serious way, in a way that again, 2 decades ago, when I tried to raise some of these issues, for example, in Brussels, the doors were being slammed in my face. So we've really made an immense amount of progress, as has Taiwan in terms of its ability to play a larger role in the Indo-Pacific and also globally. I think over the past 6-7 years, again, there's been a real sea change in how Taiwan has exercised its many talents to become a better player, a better partner, both in the region but also in the globe. So, again, real change. Now, having said that, I was struck this morning when we were, talking about the One China policy, and the term guardrails was mentioned. So, within the sort of the lanes, the sort of highway, so to speak, that Taiwan operates in, it's done quite well, and Europe and the United States have obviously helped move Taiwan more facilitously and along that path. However, if you want to expand, you have to take the guardrails down. You know, so the real question is not only what Taiwan's doing today and what it can do, but what can it do if those guardrails were removed, and particularly the one China policy. You know, how to put this in. Look, when the one China policy was developed and put forward and accepted by the United States and the rest of the West, I had hair. So, I mean, that's how long ago it was. So, I mean, we're talking about something that dates from 50 and 40 years ago. A policy that was developed during a completely different strategic era. That was based on a principle, at least in the United States, that Taiwan was then a one-party state. It did make claims against the mainland. It also was a case where the PRC was thought to be something of a partner in checking the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. And today, of course, it's not checking Moscow at all. It's in league with Moscow. So there's a real fundamental question that one has to ask about the one China policy, whether it's still relevant and whether it's a guardrail that we ought to begin to think about how to take down. I'm not saying that we should do that overnight, but I think it really is important to begin to reconsider how we think about Taiwan on the global stage and the regional stage, and whether this self-directed one China policy is something that needs to be modified and gradually removed.
Thank you, Gary. And John, what's your opening statement?
Allow me to unmute. Yeah, by way of opening, I'd really like to second that, to thank Reinhard for calling this meeting together and for inviting me to participate. It's a remarkable meeting, and I've been able to follow much of it remotely. I'd like to pick up today where, who was it? Marcin Jezewski left off yesterday with his remark that Taiwan was doing a really fine job of multi-level diplomacy in Europe, particularly engaging with subnational governments, but that links involving civil society remained a work in progress. That's my starting point here. I'd like to come at this question of local to local and civil society relations with Taiwan and see where it can take us. I'd say that in Australia's case, Taiwan has been far less successful engaging with subnational governments than it has been in Europe, and that with some exceptions, Australia's been negligent in building civil society links with Taiwan until very recent times. That is, there's a lot to be done. Let me just elaborate a little. On the first measure, subnational government-to-government linkages with Taiwan, I found while researching for a recent report on subnational links between Australia and the PRC, that Australia's town and city councils enjoy around 100 formal ties, that is 100, with cities in the People's Republic. But the sister city links with Taiwan can be counted on one hand. My state, the wealthy state of Victoria, has 20 or more twinning ties with Chinese cities, but not a single one in Taiwan. Now, ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, published these findings in its report, Taking the Low Road, China's Influence in Australian States and Territories. And that was my starting point for entering into this conversation or thinking about Taiwan and subnational relations. On the second measure, civil society relations, I'd have to say that links have severely atrophied in recent decades. Coming of age as I did in the 1960s, my generation was really quite deeply aware of Taiwan and where it stood in the world because our communities were closely engaged in so many ways. Recent generations have little appreciation of Taiwan and really no understanding of its transformation from those days of martial law to a vital democracy today. Civil society can help. So already Australia's, there are promising signs. Australia's mainstream media, remarkably, are leading the way, stationing their China correspondents in Taipei because they're unwelcome in the People's Republic. So media coverage of Taiwan has expanded and improved considerably in a setting that allows freedom of the press, as China does not. Universities have been slow in collaborating, but here too, things are picking up. In language learning, for example, the growing risks for Australians studying in China are fueling demand for study in Taiwan. And on religion, Australia's faith-based groups are interested in the lead taken by Taiwan's Tzu Buddhist community, which has been reaching out in this country for many years. And they're trying to demonstrate a shared interest in preserving freedom of religion and charitable activity in our two, dare I say it, like-minded societies. The same opportunities are there for labour unions and civil rights activists, no longer welcome in China, who'll find a common commitment to freedom of association with their counterparts in Taiwan. So on both measures, that is local government to government and civil society linkage, I sense we're on the cusp of really significant developments in this country and cooperating with Taiwan as a partner in the Indo-Pacific. More, I should add, because of China's conduct than anything else. I'll end my comments there.
Thank you, John. So I think what you can already tell from the 4 opening statements, we have a wide range of expertise and topics we're going to cover in this panel today. And first gonna hand it back to Christy. Christy, you touched on the new southbound policy, which Tsai Ing-wen announced in 2016. And we also heard in the keynote speech by the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Taiwan this morning, he made a connection or potential connection between the new southbound policy and the EU connectivity strategy. So I would like to ask you, we know the EU is Taiwan's largest inbound investor, and there are definitely growing ties. Can you elaborate a little bit how Taiwan can further collaborate with the EU in this new global context? And if, how the Deputy Foreign Minister pointed out, you see a potential growth momentum between the new southbound policy and the EU strategic connectivity?
Thank you very much for the question. I think the guest speaker already mentioned in the opening remarks about that the EU for the first time officially recognized Taiwan's role in its Indo-Pacific strategy in a few areas, including Taiwan, Japan, Korea can play a role in terms of enhancing and strengthening the supply chain here, especially for semiconductor supply chain, because Taiwan not only produce more than 60% of semiconductor, it also, the most important thing, it produce 92% of all the advanced chips to the whole world. So that is what makes TSMC so precious, not to Taiwan only, but also to the whole world. So Taiwan can play a better role in that. And also Taiwan can, right now, I understand that Taiwan has been collaborating with EU on a number of bilateral agenda that includes an EU very much focused on the human rights issue, the gender equality issue, and also LGBTI issue rights, and also labor's right issue, and also other climate change, and also circular economy issues. So all these are the areas that Taiwan can work further with EU in terms of meeting the Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as for Taiwan's external policy, and also Taiwan's willingness to demonstrate its better side, not only for its trade and economic issues. So having said that, I think I also want to point out that earlier that some speakers mentioned that there's actually one-sided development, that EU actually invests much more in Taiwan than Taiwan invested in the EU. However, that was not the case in the past 5 years. And in early 2010, Taiwan's investment into the EU only accounted for around 1% of Taiwan's total investment. But we found that in the past 5 years, starting from 2018 to this year, actually Taiwan's investment into this part of the world actually accounted for around 3.5% to 8.5% of our total our investment. So that is a significant increase of Taiwan's investment into this part of the world. due to several different reasons. One is Taiwan, most medium and large size company are revisiting their investment strategy in China, and they want to relocate their supply networks or supply chain away from China, either to other parts of Asia or to other continents. And EU is definitely one of the priority destination for their investment here. And second reason is for EU, you have this a new deal and also this digital economy deal. So all these provide a lot of opportunities for Taiwan's investment and also a bilateral economic partnership. I understand that a lot of large-sized Taiwanese companies pay a lot of attention into the development of the EV, electric vehicle, clean energy, and also circular economy here. So that is another reason for Taiwan coming here. And with regards to the investment, TSMC was mentioned, but I also have to mention one case, which is the Global Wafer, which is Taiwanese company, and this Taiwanese company, and they plan to acquire a German company here, but finally rejected. So Huanqiu Jingyuan. So I think it's the world's third largest wafer maker. So the company moved to the US, and I think starting from next month, their building of their operation is going to be launched. So I think that is the case that actually can provide a lot of policy discussion or policy dialogue between Taiwan and the EU side, so that we can understand each other's policy in terms of investment, in terms of your open strategic autonomy, so that we can better create an environment that can facilitate Taiwanese investment into this part of the world. So I think if that kind of policy dialogue can be created, my understanding is 10, 15 years ago, a lot of large-sized electronic and ICT company invested in Czech Republic, and they actually created a cluster in Czech Republic. But then they either downsize their operations or close their operation because they then moved to China. And now they are thinking to go back to Czech, but right now they're facing challenges, including the lack of land and also a labor force, and also the very expensive electricity price. So I think these are the issues that Taiwan and EU can discuss to help companies to face this kind of challenges, so that they are much more than willing to come to the EU for further investment.
Thank you, Christy. So then going from what you mentioned, policy dialogue between Taiwan and the EU, back to Zhuzha, you talked about normalizing Taiwan as a partner. And I would kindly ask you or give you time to elaborate on that a little bit. And then also yesterday over dinner, we talked about how important it is that all of the EU member states are on board when we talk about cooperation with Taiwan. So I wanted to ask you, where do you see common ground for the EU member states for interaction with Taiwan, and how could that look like?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Is it on?
I don't think so. Do you want mine?
Thank you for the question. Well, in my opening remarks, I did say that I want us to focus on really practical aspects and ways that we can really strengthen that cooperation that already exists, because the fact that the EU is the largest investor in Taiwan, I think speaks volumes of how we are already advanced in this cooperation, but I think we're in the process of upgrading perceptions. So I think I would, of course, it's difficult to talk about EU-Taiwan relations without talking about the China factor in this conversation. But I think the fact that we're having this Taiwan conference in Berlin is a strong indicator that we are in a new phase where we talk about Taiwan on its own merit as a partner, partner, not in the context of EU-China relations. That said, I think the shift that we're seeing in the awareness of Taiwan's relevance to the EU's security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific is closely linked to the China factor. So this goes back, most recently, the pandemic and the management of the pandemic in a very transparent way, bottom up, and sustainable way in Taiwan, in contrast to the mismanagement and the lack of transparency in dealing with COVID in the PRC, and also the refusal or the rejection of any demands for transparency and investigation into the origins of COVID. And I think this has really enabled Europeans to see Taiwan as, in a way, the opposite of the PRC when it comes to the partnership that we can build up. And I said earlier that we see Taiwan as reliable, and I think there's no doubt there, also as transparent. And I go back to Audrey Tang's radical transparency phrase, which I think is a very good one to talk about transparency in Taiwan and the importance of transparency, not just in managing the pandemic, but also in managing the threat that comes from the PRC. So these elements are really important in seeing Taiwan as a partner and in changing the narrative. So we are in the process of upgrading relations, but I think it's also interesting or important to highlight that we have not defined what an upgrade means. So how do we define that? Because I think we need this flexibility. And that goes back to the fact that the EU is 27 countries. And having 27 countries behind one policy or one strategy or one vision is very difficult. But I think there is consensus that we need to rethink our relationship with China. And closely linked to that is the fact that we are also in the process of rethinking our ties with Taiwan. And the Indo-Pacific provides that opportunity at that framework where we can think in practical terms of resilient supply chains, reconfiguration of supply chains, ocean governance, data laws. I think these are the issues these are the areas that are in the Indo-Pacific strategy explicitly, and Taiwan is mentioned 4 or 5 times in the strategy. And I think, and Mr. Bütikofer here would probably agree that I think there is no resolution that comes out of the European Parliament that touches upon common foreign and security policy or defense policy or China or Indo-Pacific that does not have Taiwan in it. And I think this started to change back in 2020, I believe, or 21 perhaps, is the first time that I myself could see so much focus on Taiwan in that annual CFSP, Common Foreign and Security Policy on Taiwan. And since then, we had some resolutions that really set a precedent for how we look at Taiwan. So we had the first time ever resolution on a standalone resolution on Taiwan. So this is all part of that process of upgrading ties. And I think this is where we have to be careful. If we measure the upgrade in having a BIA or not having a BIA, then I think that's the wrong way of looking at the relationship. And so perhaps, if I may just come back to Gary's point, because I think the aim here is to really look at practical cooperation. And I think that's why I would always try to, I think we need to be very clear about the policy versus principle question. And I think if we go down that road, then we forget that the EU has its own one China policy. And I think it is a boundary, it is a limitation, and this is the reality. We need to be realistic. But it's the way I look at it is that it should not be seen as a limitation of what we can do with Taiwan. Because everything that we are already developing with Taiwan on a mutual basis, and I think this is another important point that we see between Central Eastern European countries and Taiwan, is this virtuous cycle that developed through the pandemic with masks and vaccines is to reciprocate solidarity and to treat each other as partners. And I think the reason why I wanted to just touch upon the policy versus principle and whether we need to change that or reconsider that, I think we are in the process of seeing what are the limitations, but also what are the opportunities. So I think that's why it's so important to signal that to Beijing that we have the right to cooperate with Taiwan, and this is the process that I think most member states, I would say all member states agree on this. Where we need to work on is what is the way forward with China in terms of rebalancing the ties, and that goes back to the diversification question, but I think it also is an important element in building up deterrence, because our collective economic weight, I think, in terms of the European Union, is our economic weight. But I think where we are weak is using that strategically. So we spoke also about instruments that we are in the process of putting forward as defensive instruments that can build up that deterrence, even just by having the instruments. I think the anti-coercion instrument is a good example. So I just wanted to touch on the policy principle question as well. And yeah, I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Zsuzsa. Gary, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but my next question is to you anyway, so you might want to combine that. So when we hopped on the prep call for this, you teasered that you think there is a gap between the recognized strategic importance of Taiwan and the actual policies, especially from the US. And I would be very curious to hear more about that. Would ask you to elaborate a little bit. Where do you see that gap? And of course, also, how can we bridge that gap and how can we close that?
Okay. So let me be clear. When I put on the table the one China policy, I'm not saying that a lot hasn't been done and more can be done and has been done under that policy. So I take that as a given. The question is how much further you can expand with the one China policy overhanging things. I can only speak from the experience in dealing with the U.S. government and when I was in government. Within the sort of administrations and bureaucracy, it becomes really relevant because when policy proposals are put forward, one of the first things that happens is government officials go, well, what's our fundamental policy? And they say, one China policy. And then they have to think through whether or not the one China policy is being edged aside or being kept, or it's, in other words, it does have a real impact, practically speaking, in policy decisions in a way that may not be sort of obvious, but on a day-to-day level, it actually does have an impact. So I take your points. On the other hand, I think realistically, to be realistic, it has created a culture and a bureaucratic instinct about how to think about Taiwan that I think inhibits the ability to expand what Taiwan's role can be, both in Europe and the US. But again, I take your point. On the gap, so I would say, from perhaps the second Obama administration, there was a new consensus in the United States, both in Congress, in the public, and in the administration about the strategic importance of Taiwan. Its location, its role in the supply chains, its economic power, the fact that it sits between two American allies, the fact that Taiwan's sort of the door to the greater Pacific, all those things came together, plus combined with Chinese behavior, meant that there really was a kind of new consensus about the importance of Taiwan. Now, having said that, if you really think Taiwan's security is really strategically important, what are you going to do about it? And so on the importance level, I think President Biden's repeated statement that he would go to war, the United States would go to war to help defend Taiwan, is actually just a realization of how that consensus is now playing out. I think the president is quite serious about that. I think every president since Obama probably knows that Taiwan cannot be allowed to be captured by the PRC or threatened in a dramatic existential way. So I think that's the way things are in the United States at this point. However, if you remember when President Obama mentioned, or not mentioned, but put forward the pivot to Asia, that was premised on a couple of things. One, that the European security situation would be benign, right? Second thing, a little less talked about, is the fact that one reason why there could be a pivot in the strategic situation that he was living in was that the Pentagon had concluded that it only had sufficient capability, both in the size of its force and in the quality of the force, to handle one major Eurasian crisis at a time. Right. Speed forward to today. The actual budget of the United States Defense Department, which is, huge, is actually, if you include inflation, no larger than was back in 2011 when the Pentagon was saying we can only handle one crisis at a time. The size of the force is actually smaller. So, what we have in a strategic, crisis, both in Russia or in Eastern Europe, with Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and also a building strategic problem set in Asia. The United States, so there's this gap between what we're now saying we want to do or we need to do and what we're capable of doing. Now, when it comes to Taiwan in particular, yes, there's been advances in an effort to provide better and more equipment to Taiwan. But there's other problems, that delays in providing that equipment. There's also been delays in the Congress because the administration not approving certain things that would help Taiwan's defenses, such as training from the National Guard for Taiwan's forces and the like. Anyway, there's a whole list of things that if you think this situation in deterring China and there's an urgency to it, the urgency isn't being met with policies and or resources. Let me just sort of jump to an analogy since the World Cup's going on. If you think about the United States and working with Japan and Australia and to a lesser degree India and somewhat South Korea, when you're talking about this deterrent posture, it's as though the United States has built a team for football that has, its forward line strikers, that has good midfield, but somehow it's completely decided not to have a back line. So in any, soccer game or football game that you have, if you don't have a good back line, there's a hole and you're not going to be successful in doing the things you want to do. So again, I think there's a fairly significant gap between what the United States thinks is a primary security concern in Asia, which is Taiwan, and actually what is being done.
Thank you, Gary. Then I would like to turn my attention again to you, John. So we talked about the EU, we talked about the US. We haven't talked that much actually about the region itself. So my question for you, John, would be how, can you elaborate a little bit on the current state of affairs the Australian government has vis-a-vis Taiwan, and also where do you think the EU can take lessons from that example?
Yes, thank you. I guess, Australia positions itself in that larger security and deterrence frame that we've been discussing here. But I'd rather not focus on that because that's received attention in other panels and by other speakers. What I want to speak specifically about here is Australia's position on Taiwan. And I think it highlights a common challenge that we have that is worth putting on the table here. It's this. that Australia's basic position on Taiwan has really remained unchanged for half a century. It's set out in the One China policy, which is much the same as those found in the countries of Europe. In fact, it tells us very little about where we are today, because this kind of continuity of policy and long-term consistency of policy on Taiwan really doesn't seem to amount to much anymore. That is, consistency no longer seems to mean certainty. Thinking of the Nancy Pelosi visit and all that followed, it seems that no major player has actually changed its position on Taiwan formally, and yet here we are at a point of potential conflict. So what this means for a country like Australia, and I expect it's the same for others, is that the long-standing approach based on precedent and consistency, in a way a lazy approach, is no longer a useful guide for the future, because the same actions no longer carry the same value for China. That's what we learned of the Pelosi visit. So it's both new and unsettling. The present Australian government appears unwilling to move on trade or other new agreements with Taiwan, even though these fall within the terms of its One China policy, for fear that it can no longer predict the consequences of actions. And that's a dangerous position to be in, as I said, new and unsettling. At the same time, just to return to Gary's point, there's no appetite in Australia to jump the guardrails. So we're in an awkward position, if I can put it that way. It's very difficult to move forward at the government level. And that's why I think people like me need to focus on the subnational and the civil society level. As for the lessons Europe might learn from this, well, I guess I don't know that it's a lesson that I was just noting, but it's a dilemma that I think we share. But I think what this meeting demonstrates is this is a mutual learning exercise. And I've taken a lot away from the earlier panels and from this one, come to appreciate the depth of the understanding and the engagement in Europe on what working closely with Taiwan means. It's quite remarkable, and I'm very impressed. One thing I'd stress, though, is that the role that elected representatives and parliaments and progressive political parties can play is crucial. And I think this meeting is a sign of that. In Australia, a joint committee of federal parliament reviewed Taiwan's claims to CPTPP membership and reviewed prospects for bilateral trade relations and so on. And earlier this year made strong recommendations to government, positive recommendations to move forward on both. Now, I don't think the government will. Nevertheless, such clear statements from legislators are important, even when the government of the day doesn't act on their recommendations, because elected members help to keep sensitive issues like this in the public eye. They help to convene meetings like this in which people share experience and insights, just as you're doing here in relation to Taiwan at this meeting. So all credit to you. I think we should hold a similar meeting in our country and get heads together and bang them together and come up with some new ideas as well. It's the time to do it, and I really value everything you're doing there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I think we're already running short on time, and I think that's a testament to the many perspectives we can discuss here. I'll just have one last question to all of you before we open this up to the audience Q&A, and that is bringing us back to next steps for further engagement with Taiwan. And we heard so many different aspects, economic aspects, people-to-people ties, the role of policy changes, visits, etc. So each of you, what do you think are the important steps forward or potential steps for further engagement?
Yeah, thank you. But before that, I would like to quickly respond to the issue of CPTPP. I'm not a security person, so I can only speak for the issue area of trade and economy and investment. I think the WTO has created a status for Taiwan, which is separate custom territory, and that is already mentioned yesterday. So I think in terms of engagement engaging or developing trade agreement, investment agreement, we have already developed. We don't use the term free trade agreement. We use the term economic cooperation agreement with Singapore and New Zealand. These two countries also abide by one China policy, and they are perfectly okay. And also for most of the Asian countries, especially for India and also for Southeast Asian countries, they all have one China policy, but they have much more flexibility in terms of interpreting the policy and also in terms of getting what they want with Taiwan. So I think for Western country, probably you are still stick to this one very rigid one China policy. But in other parts of the world, the Asian countries, that they already under their own one China policy have a lot of engagement with Taiwan, and they are actually benefited from their flexibility of the policy. For example, we have a representative office, and we do have ministerial officials visiting each other from time to time, though sometimes they don't use their title as a minister. They use something like ambassador at large, or a professor at a university, or an advisor of business association. So I think that kind of flexibility actually help all this country to create much more space, much more room to further engage with Taiwan and to forge closer ties with Taiwan. So with regards to CPTPP, actually, Taiwan submitted the application last September under the, we use the status separate custom territory, same as the status we use in the WTO, and also the status we use when we signed the trade agreement with Singapore and New Zealand. I don't see that has anything to do with the one China policy, because it's not a sovereign country. If you insist, it's a acceptable climate nature for Taiwan. So I think if country can show more flexibility, and probably Taiwan can have much room. And by having that room, and then we can definitely create a lot more critical, vital partnership with every part of the world.
Thank you. I also would like to address some of the points made by John concerning how there's no policy change. But I think across the region, there's a huge change in perceptions. And I think what we see come out of Japan also in terms of the support and the level of the place where Taiwan is in the Japanese political discourse is a clear indication of the change in perception. And I think this is what the countries in the region, like regional states in the Indo-Pacific, share, because in fact, the entire Indo-Pacific concept, the reemergence of it recently, is driven by the shared concerns of, well, the change in the balance of power, but also the fear of countries in the region of not being stuck in between, having to choose sides between the United States and China. And I think this is something that keeps the EU also close to, in cooperation with these countries, which also demands a more inclusive approach. And I think this is part of the language that comes out of India, clearly also Australia, also the European Union. Less so, I would say, from Washington. So I think when we talk about like-mindedness and also our own differences or our own, perhaps we all share the same vision, but I think in terms of having a common strategy in the region, in spite of the fact that there is no policy change, the perceptions are changing in that regard. So I just had that thought commenting earlier on John's points. And to your question, going forward, I think we are, as I said, in this process of upgrading ties, of an awareness of Taiwan that is unprecedented. And I think here is important to highlight that the responsibility lies on both ends, where we need to bring Taiwan closer to European audiences, and this is, I think, what we're doing today. But I think also Taiwan needs to do its own part in bringing Europe closer to Taiwan. As I'm based in Taiwan for the past 2-3 years now, I do see that Europe is slowly, climbing up the agenda, but it's a very slow process. It's very dominated by the United States and Japan, which is positive that we see a regional integration and awareness of Taiwan. But I think Europe, especially when I teach European studies, there's a lot of interest in Europe, but Europe is complicated and it's far. And I think we need to work on communication, and that communication has to be strategic vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis our own audiences, but also vis-a-vis Beijing. And this is why I was referring earlier, or wanted to make a point about the importance of pushing back against narrative that is disinformation, essentially. And that, again, takes me back to what we can do together. What clearly disinformation is an area that was identified as an area that it's of joint interest. And that's why we had the European Parliament visit of the special committee that works on foreign interference visit Taiwan. And that was a historic visit because it was the first time the European Parliament sent such a group, such a delegation. So working on this information, I think that allows the Taiwanese audience to understand European complexities when it comes to our relationship with Russia. I think that's one important area. And I think also, because we mentioned the GCTF only briefly, I think now that Japan since 2019 is a full partner, and Australia since 2021, I think the EU should consider, or this should be considered, how the EU could be such a partner. This doesn't mean that individual member states have not been able to participate and host seminars in the past. This has happened. The Czech Republic and other countries have co-hosted. But I think, again, going back to Japan, 2021 was an important year because also Japan for the first time hosted this GCTF meeting that year. So that's a concrete, I like to think of really practical ways of bringing the two sides closer together. So GCTF is clearly something that needs to be considered, and parliamentary diplomacy and city diplomacy. I think this is something where I know we're running out of time, so I will stop here, but that's been, I believe, the most effective avenue to bring the two sides closer together and to maintain and sustain that partnership.
Thank you. Gary, do you want to briefly comment?
Three quick things. One, there's an absolute need to bolster the deterrence vis-a-vis PRC and Taiwan. We're way behind the curve on that, and it's just there's an urgency that should take place that frankly I haven't seen happen in the administration. Second thing that should be done is, which probably won't be done, is the reversal of the last two U.S. administrations when it comes to free trade. I think it's absolutely essential if we're going to have like-minded efforts among the liberal democracies and the non-autocratic states of the world. The American market has to be open, and unless it leads along that front, we'll just see a continuation of moving away from the kinds of globalization that has produced all kinds of wealth and moved so many people out of poverty. And the third thing, which will be very provocative coming from an American, is I'd like to see one European country recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state.
John, do you want to comment, or can we jump to the audience Q&A?
I'd just like to endorse what's been said by the earlier speakers, though I take exception to Gary's on that point, but we can argue that another time. Yes, by all means, go straight to questions.
Okay, perfect. Then I'm going to collect briefly. I'm going to start in this corner.
Hi, William Young from Deutsche Welle. I have two questions. One is following up on what Zhuja just said about Taiwan's responsibility. I think one interesting aspect that I wanted to add that is the newly appointed Taiwan representative to the EU, Remus Chen, has a deep experience in Washington. And then I think there seems to be an intention of trying to bring the Washington style kind of like Taiwan-US culmination and cultivation of the deep ties to try to bring that model to the European Union and try to replicate that success. So would love to get some views from you in terms of like whether you think that kind of model could work in the European framework. And another thing, going to either John or Gary, is that both of you, I think, talked about the importance of, strengthening the deterrence in the region against, like China. But what would be the next concrete step in both of your views in terms of like, furthering the policies that we've already seen? If your, I think, preference is that there needs to be more deterrence, like building on top of the existing policies. Thank you.
Thanks, Tatiana. Marcin Jerzewski from the European Values Center for Security Policy. I have two questions, one for Christy and one for John. So, Christy, given that the objective of this panel is to situate Taiwan in the broader Indo-Pacific context, I have a question related to the new southbound policy and the very conspicuous exclusion of the Pacific Island states, including Taiwan's 4 diplomatic allies, from the new southbound policy. So if you could briefly comment on your understanding, on your perception of why that exclusion took place. And then secondly, with conversations taking place right now about a potential publication of a new southbound policy 2.0, evaluating it 6 years since its initial publication, do you see any prospects for expansion of this cooperation scheme to the Pacific Island states? And then my question to John is related to civil society cooperation. So thank you so much for making a reference to my points from yesterday. Specifically in the Australian context, one development which I have viewed as positive in terms of building up civil society exchanges between both sides is the Colombo mobility grants to Australian students to come to Taiwan. So I would be keen to hear your thoughts on whether you think it is a sufficient and important step to bring the two societies closer. Thank you.
And I think the first question was to Zhuja and Gary.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. I think what will be important for the Taiwanese representatives based in Europe is to really seize this momentum and opening that there is across Europe, I would say, that goes with the point I made about the deterioration of perceptions of China and of Chinese influence in Europe. And in contrast to that, the positive perception that that people have of Taiwan. So I think it does require, and I'm not suggesting that there is no strategy, it just requires a really smart and sharp and sophisticated strategy that really exploits that opportunity. In Brussels clearly is a good place because it brings together all 27 countries, and working with the European Parliament is a good platform for visibility. So visibility is clearly where it starts, but then content needs to follow that up. So, I mean, we don't have time to go into much detail, but I think it needs to be very targeted and keep in mind the diversity that we have. And diversity, I know, means complexity, but partnering up with European partners, that could be perhaps also a very useful way. So.
On deterrence, one just simple point. So you have President Biden saying the United States would go to war to help defend Taiwan. But at this particular moment, there's never been an occasion where U.S. Military has sat down with the Taiwanese military and sorted out how that would actually work. So that's sort of like, you know, again, using a football analogy, you know, going up against another country's World Cup team, but half your players have never actually practiced together. So at the most fundamental level, deterrence requires that kind of cooperation, and so far it doesn't exist. I just went on the EU model and the US model. Look, the big difference is the US is a unitary government and the EU is multi-members, and so it's much more difficult to get a consensus built around, you know, 27 or 30 countries, 40 countries, whatever, as opposed to what happens in the US. So it's a much higher hurdle, I think, to climb or jump over.
I actually put notes on the Pacific Island but I didn't mention that. So, you know, we have several countries with diplomatic relation in Pacific Island region, and so far the New Southbound policy has not expanded coverage to that area yet. But as the competition, the power competition between U.S. and China is getting more acute and more acute in that region. So Taiwan has already approached the U.S. and also the Australian government in terms of any possibility of collaboration to provide capacity building or technical assistance to Pacific Island country. And one highlight is that we can provide assistance to help them adapt to this climate change issues. And also for another issue is about the Medicare. It's about the Medicare and also public health issues. So I think the Pacific Island countries are going to be the focus, not within the scope of the New Southbound policy, but it can be an issue that we can outreach to Australia and probably New Zealand and also the US and also US. So I think that's for the Pacific Island country. I want to respond to your question as to the next step. I think I support what she already mentioned about that we need to create more platforms for Taiwan EU to work together. And also we try to propose in the past year that we can actually reach out to the third country. By third country, for example, a number of Southeast Asian countries, they have very close relations with EU. For example, Vietnam and EU already have their FTA entering into forces 2 years ago. And actually a lot of Taiwanese companies are investing in Vietnam, targeting the European market. So with that regard, I believe that we can work together in terms of bringing this third country for issues such as corporate governance, climate change, and also ESG. So that is another area that we can consider for bilateral collaboration for the next stage. John?
Yes, there's a moment. I won't take too much. It does seem to me that perceptions have changed in the region because this is not just about Taiwan. This is about China's challenge to the post-war order. It includes Taiwan, but it also includes the East China Sea, the South China Sea, Japan's post-war constitution, the position of Australia in relation to its security umbrella, and so on. That's why the Taiwan question, or perceptions of the Taiwan issue, are taking on a different flavor. And I think we need to bear that in mind. Given that, the question is, do we stay within the guardrails and move outside of them? It's a very important point. This comes to education and so on. It seems to me we haven't yet tested all the potential of the guardrails before we jump over them. If we do push forward with educational links and other civil society links, if we do push forward with trade and say the various trade agreements and bilateral and as well as multilateral, if we can move forward with those within the guardrails, well and good. If for some reason we cannot, even though they're within the guardrails, then we've got a problem. It's then, it seems to me, we say, these guardrails aren't working. We can't even do what we're permitted to do within them. What does that mean for the guardrails? And given that the Taiwan issue is sitting in a much bigger frame of geopolitical transformation in the East Asian region affecting all the neighborhood, affecting Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and others. That's going to be a very important question going forward.
Thank you. And on that note, I'm going to wrap that up. Thank you to my great panelists. I hope we can continue this discussion over lunch. And of course, thank you to Mr. Bütikofer for having us.
Government, academia, NGOs from different countries, including, for instance, and I repeat the phrase that I used in the introduction, Taiwan's favorite country in Europe, Lithuania. Thank you, Minister, for being here. I believe it has been worthwhile, and I believe we should make greater efforts to have these kind of discussions more often. And I also believe that we would benefit a lot if we could have more discussions that bring together people from the European horizon, people from America. I mean, the transatlantic exchange has a strong tradition, and we should stick to that. But at the same time, we should enhance also our exchanges with partners from the Indo-Pacific region more broadly. Partners from, well, here we have Taiwan, but also from Japan, from other Asian countries. It's not fully sunk in that Asia is much greater than China in some of the European conversations, but that is indeed something we should focus on. So I want to thank all of you that have contributed to this experience. I really enjoyed it. Second, in the last panel, we've basically touched upon the issue of gradualism or rupture. And I would quote the Chinese saying that teaches us that we have to walk on two legs. I think we should take every opportunity to build on gradualism, because it's rarely, in a democracy, it's rarely a popular desire to rock the boat if there is not an absolute need to do that. Nobody experienced that in a more difficult way than President Roosevelt when he tried to convince the American public that there was indeed a need to join the war against Nazi Germany and also to fight back against Japanese imperialism at the time. But we should not be captivated by gradualism to a degree that we miss the boat because we don't want to rock the boat. And we are experiencing great changes. And we're experiencing surprising developments that we may not have been prepared for. So I think indeed we have to walk on two legs. And I would want to pick up what Gary said, because I've rarely heard that from an American lately. Europe is learning the lesson of using trade policy effectively in a world where geopolitics trumps geoeconomics. And even the Green Party, I would say, is learning that lesson. And I would really hope that America is relearning that lesson too. And my next remark is this. I believe the future is not a fate. When Xi Jinping talks about a community of common destiny, to me that sounds like an attempt to impose a future that would have been defined in Beijing. I don't think that we should fall into that trap. I don't believe in inevitability. We can shape a good future, and as regards EU-Taiwan relations, I think it needs two dimensions to be addressed: the dimension of partnering and also the dimension of deterrence. Not just one of them, but both. And we should not fall under the spell of an ideology that says that everything is preordained in one way or another. So as regards the often quoted question, when will China attack Taiwan? I would side with Kevin Rudd, who has spoken about the avoidable war. And I think we should invest as much as we can into finding ways of avoiding such a catastrophe, and working together is part of that. So I believe in a free and democratic future that we can shape, but we must take responsibility when we want to shape that. And my last remark is just bidding you farewell, wishing you the best of health and safe travels. Thank you.
It's beautiful code. It's a beautiful cooperation. You talk so much about resilient, and this resilience is also in the name. Reinhardt, heart means resilient, to stick to your fight for democracy. And Ryan, that means pure, that means soul, and that means solidarity. Thank you very much again, Mr. Beautiful, and thank you for your support. Thank you.